One weekend, one decision, and an entire world that the ultra-wealthy had spent decades carefully building vanished in a single night. Imagine spending 10 years building your dream life in Dubai. You have the penthouse on the Palm. You have the membership at the most exclusive clubs in the world. You have the yacht docked at one of the most photographed marinas on the planet. You have the office on the 47th floor of a tower with a view that makes every morning feel like a reward. You wake up every day in a city that has no income tax, no capital gains tax, and a skyline that looks like someone gave a child unlimited money and told them to dream as big as they could. You have built something rare. You have built a life that feels untouchable. And then, on a Saturday night, a sound you have never heard before rattles your floor-to-ceiling windows. You walk to the glass, you look out at the sky over the Persian Gulf, and you see fire. Not fireworks, not a celebration. Real fire, real smoke, real destruction raining down from above. And in that exact moment, every piece of the dream you built starts to crack. Not slowly, not gently, all at once, like glass shattering inward. That is exactly what happened in the last weekend of February 2026. And what followed was one of the most dramatic, desperate, and revealing evacuations the modern world has ever witnessed. Not of refugees, not of people fleeing poverty, but of the planet's most powerful, most connected, most resourced human beings, scrambling with everything they had just to get out alive. This is the story of what happened when the safest city in the world stopped being safe. This is the story of convoys of blacked-out SUVs racing through the desert in the dead of night. This is the story of private jets selling for $350,000 a seat and people paying it without hesitation. This is the story of how Riyadh, a city that was never supposed to be anyone's safe haven, became the last door open in the entire Middle East. And it is the story of what that says about power, wealth, perception, and just how fragile the most polished corners of civilization really are. Let us go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of this particular crisis, but the beginning of the story that made this crisis so shocking. Because to truly understand why what happened was so stunning, you need to understand what Dubai and Abu Dhabi had become. You need to understand the identity, the brand, the promise that these two cities had spent the better part of 3 decades building and selling to the world's most demanding, most skeptical, and most selective buyers, the ultra-wealthy. Dubai started its transformation in earnest in the 1990s, when the Emirates leadership made a decision that was bold to the point of recklessness. They looked at their oil reserves and saw something no one else was willing to acknowledge out loud. The reserves were finite. The oil would run out. And when it did, what would Dubai be? The leadership's answer was to build something that would outlast the oil. A city so attractive, so efficient, so glamorous, and so tax-friendly that the world's money, the world's talent, and the world's most ambitious people would choose it not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Over the following 3 decades, they executed that vision with a precision and a scale that left the rest of the world watching in disbelief. The numbers alone tell part of the story. Dubai International Airport became the busiest international airport in the world, handling more than 90 million passengers a year. The Palm Jumeirah, an artificial island shaped like a palm tree and visible from space, became home to some of the most expensive real estate on Earth. The Burj Khalifa, standing 828 meters tall, became not just the world's tallest building, but the centerpiece of a skyline that had been conjured from desert sand in less than 40 years. Abu Dhabi, the UAE's capital city next door, moved quietly but just as surely, building sovereign wealth funds worth hundreds of billions of dollars, attracting Formula One, attracting the Louvre, attracting the financial institutions and hedge funds and private equity firms that wanted a foothold in the Gulf without the political noise of Riyadh and without the chaos of Beirut. And through all of it, the one thing both cities sold above everything else, above the sunshine, above the tax breaks, above the glamour, was safety. The UAE marketed itself as a bubble, a place outside the turbulence of the BR. Outer Middle East, a place where the geopolitical storms that ravaged its neighbors somehow did not reach. A place where you could live your life, build your business, and sleep soundly, regardless of what was happening in Tehran, in Baghdad, in Beirut, or in Damascus. That promise was worth more than any tax incentive. That promise was the foundation on which everything else was built, and for decades it held. Wealthy Russians moved their money there after sanctions hit. Wealthy Chinese business people moved their families there. Indian billionaires opened regional headquarters. British bankers relocated. American hedge fund managers set up offices. Lebanese families, whose own country had been destabilized for so long it barely functioned, moved their wealth and their children to Dubai because Dubai felt like the opposite of instability. The city became a magnet for everyone who had something to lose and wanted somewhere safe to keep it. By 2025, over 3 million expats lived in the UAE. The country had become not just a financial hub, but something rarer, a sanctuary. And then the United States and Israel struck Iran. On the morning of Saturday, February 28, 2026, the joint U.S.-Israeli military operation hit Iran with a ferocity and precision that sent shockwaves around the world. The strikes targeted military infrastructure, government sites, and nuclear facilities across Iran. They killed Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who had led the country since 1989, and they set in motion a chain of events that would destroy, in the space of 48 hours, the carefully maintained illusion of Gulf safety that had taken 30 years to build. Iran did not wait long to respond. By Saturday night, Iranian missiles and drones were already in the air, but they were not headed toward Israel alone. They were headed toward every country in the Gulf that hosted American military assets, which, as it turned out, meant almost all of them. Qatar, home to Al Udeid Air Base, the largest U.S. military installation in the Middle East. Bahrain, where the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet has its headquarters. Kuwait, where the U.S. maintains Ali Al Salam Air Base. And the UAE, home to Al Dhafra Air Base, a critical American military hub. All of them were targeted simultaneously. All of them were hit. The UAE's Ministry of Defense scrambled its air defenses immediately. Over the course of the first night and into Sunday, those defenses intercepted 165 ballistic missiles, 2 cruise missiles, and more than 540 Iranian drones. Those numbers are staggering. 540 drones, 165 ballistic missiles. The scale of the Iranian response was not a warning. It was not a message. It was a full-scale retaliatory assault, and the UAE found itself directly in the center of it. Not everything was intercepted cleanly. Debris from knockdown weapons fell across the city. Fires broke out at some of Dubai's most iconic locations. A fire burned at the Fairmont Hotel on Palm Jumeirah, one of the most recognizable hotels in the world, sitting on the artificial island that had become the global symbol of Dubai's ambition. Flames were seen licking the exterior of the Burj Al Arab, the sail-shaped hotel that is arguably the most photographed building in the UAE and one of the most recognizable structures on Earth. Smoke rose near the Burj Khalifa. Fire broke out at Jebel Ali Port, Dubai's main sea terminal and one of the busiest shipping hubs in the entire region. And then came the moment that perhaps, more than any other, shattered the illusion. Dubai's international airport, the world's busiest international airport, was struck. A concourse sustained damage. 4 employees were injured. And then the airport, the beating heart of Dubai's identity as a global hub, was closed. For people who lived in Dubai, who had staked their lives, their businesses, and their futures on the city's safety, this was not just a military event. It was something more personal and more devastating than that. It was the moment the story they had been told, and had chosen to believe, ended. Cinzia Bianco, an expert on the Persian Gulf at the European Council on Foreign Relations, captured it perfectly when she wrote that night. This is Dubai's ultimate nightmare, as its very essence depended on being a safe oasis in a troubled region. That single sentence said everything. Dubai's entire value proposition had been built on safety, and in one night, that proposition had collapsed. Now think about what happens next. The airport is closed, the airspace over the UAE is shut down completely. Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, all of them have closed their airspace too. Commercial airlines from around the world, Air India, British Airways, Lufthansa, Cathay Pacific, Virgin Atlantic, Qatar Airways, Kuwait Airways, are canceling flights, suspending services, redirecting planes in the air. By Sunday morning, nearly 6,000 flights have been canceled worldwide. Almost 30,000 have been delayed. The entire air network of the Middle East has effectively stopped. And now you have 3 million expats in the UAE. You have tens of thousands of tourists who flew in for a winter holiday, peak season in Dubai, when the weather is perfect and the city is at its most seductive. You have senior executives from global finance firms, hedge funds, banks, private equity houses, who were either based there or visiting for business. You have high net worth individuals with families. You have billionaires with private jets that cannot fly because the airports they use are closed or destroyed. You have a city full of wealthy, powerful, well-connected people, and none of them, not one, can get out. The panic that set in was real, and it was immediate. But this was not the panic of people without resources. This was the panic of people who had spent their entire lives buying their way out of problems, and who were now discovering that there are some problems money cannot easily buy you out of. Some problems require more than money. They require luck and geography and timing. And in those first hours, luck, geography, and timing were all pointing in the same terrifying direction. Security firms started working the phones before the sun rose on Sunday morning. The clients calling them were not ordinary people. They were the kind of people who have dedicated security teams, who have emergency protocols, who have relationships with private aviation brokers and jet charter companies. They were the kind of people for whom a private jet is a normal travel option. not a luxury they have to save up for. And even these people, with all their connections and all their money, were finding that the normal routes and the normal solutions were simply not available. Post. Instead, Kane laid out a far grimmer picture. American and Allied casualties, air defense systems stretched to their breaking point, a military force already strained from operations in the Caribbean, the Red Sea, and Eastern Europe, and the very real possibility of something the Pentagon fears more than any single battle, a prolonged conflict with no clear exit, bleeding American resources, American lives, and American credibility into a Middle Eastern war with no defined end. That warning never left the Situation Room through the front door. It walked out through a side window, straight to the press, and that is the heart of the entire controversy. Now, on the surface, a general warning a president about the risks of war sounds completely normal. That is literally what generals are supposed to do. Their job is not just to fight wars. Their job is to tell the truth about what wars actually cost. And the truth about a sustained military campaign against Iran, a nation of 90 million people with one of the most sophisticated air defense networks in the Middle East, is not a comfortable truth. American air defenses in the region are not at full strength. The munitions stockpile has been under serious pressure since the operations against the Houthis in the Red Sea and the Midnight Hammer strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities back in June of 2025. The carriers have been at sea for months. The machines need maintenance. The people inside those machines need rest. So on paper, what General Kane was saying is not radical. It is responsible. It is what any honest military advisor owes a commander before that commander sends young men and women into a war zone. But here is the part that changes the entire picture. General Kane did not just say these things privately. Somebody in that room, or somebody close to that room, picked up a phone and called a reporter. And the details of that private presidential briefing, the warnings, the concerns, the casualty estimates, the readiness problems, appeared in major national newspapers within hours, before the President of the United States had a chance to respond, before his staff could shape the message, before anyone in the White House could control the narrative. And that is not a general doing his job. That is something else entirely. Trump's reaction was immediate, and it was volcanic. He went straight to Truth Social, and he did what Donald Trump always does when he believes someone has crossed him. He denied everything, he attacked the story, and he made his position absolutely clear. In his own words, the reports that the Pentagon was warning him against attacking Iran were, quote, 100% incorrect. He went further than that. He said that if the United States military went to war with Iran, it would be, in his words, something easily won. He pushed back on the idea that General Kane had opposed military action, insisting that Kane would support whatever the president ordered and believed American forces would prevail. But here is the uncomfortable reality underneath that bravado. The Wall Street Journal did not make the story up. The New York Times did not make it up. NPR did not make it up. Every major outlet that ran this story had multiple sources. Sources inside the Pentagon, sources inside the National Security Council, sources with direct knowledge of what was said in that Situation Room. These were not anonymous internet rumors. These were sourced, verified, cross-referenced reports from reporters who have covered the American military for decades. So either Trump is right that the reporting is wildly exaggerated, or there's a deliberate, organized effort inside his own Defense Department to shape public perception of his war plans. And you can decide which of those two possibilities frightens you more. Because let us look at the full picture of what these leaks actually achieved. Think about this strategically for a moment. When the Pentagon leaks a story saying the military is not ready for a sustained campaign, that it lacks the munitions for a prolonged conflict, that aircraft carriers need servicing, what does that do? It handcuffs the President of the United States in public. If Trump now orders a large-scale strike on Iran and things go wrong, he cannot say he was not warned. The warning is in the newspaper. The warning is on the record. Every casualty, every setback, every crisis would be traced back to those front-page stories and the president who ignored them. That is not just military advice, that is political protection. And it raises a question that people inside Washington are genuinely arguing about. Is the Pentagon warning Trump because they care about the mission or because they want their own hands clean when the history books are written? Now zoom out even further because the Pentagon leaks are only one part of this fractured picture. The confusion does not stop at the Pentagon's gates. It extends all the way to the top of the Trump administration itself, where the president's own team cannot seem to agree on what they're actually trying to do with Iran. On one side, you have Vice President J.D. Vance. He has been clear, consistent, and direct. The goal, he says, is not regime change. The United States is not at war with the Iranian people. It is not trying to topple the Ayatollah. The target is singular, Iran's nuclear program. Stop the bombs from being built and the crisis is over. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has echoed the same line, clean, focused, limited. And then Donald Trump opens his phone. On the exact same days that Vance was delivering that measured message, Trump posted on social media asking, and this is a real quote from the sitting president of the United States, why there should not be regime change if Iran cannot, in his words, make Iran great again. He finished that post with the letters MEGA. It was not a joke. It was not a hypothetical. It was the President of the United States publicly contradicting his own vice president and his own defense secretary in a social media post in the middle of nuclear negotiations, while 2 aircraft carriers were positioned for possible combat operations. Account for all of these layers working together simultaneously, you have an aircraft that is not just hard to detect. You have an aircraft that is essentially invisible against almost all of the radar and tracking technology that Iran currently operates. But Iran's weakness against stealth jets goes far beyond the technology gap between American aircraft and Iranian radar systems. Because the night that Iran was struck was not the beginning of Iran's vulnerability. It was the culmination of a process that had been building for 9 consecutive days before a single American Dickel and devastating campaign targeting Iran's air defense infrastructure specifically. For 9 straight days, Israeli F-35s, F-15Is, and F-16Is struck radar stations, missile batteries, command and control centers, and communication hubs across Iran. And by the time the American strike package arrived 9 days later, Iran's air defense network had already been profoundly and systematically damaged. Israeli strikes destroyed approximately 120 Iranian air defense launchers, roughly 1/3 of Iran's total air def, and say inventory before the conflict began. Radar sites that once provided coverage over critical approach corridors into Iranian airspace, silenced. Command centers that coordinated the link between radar detection and missile engagement, destroyed. The communication infrastructure that allowed DIF or K to share data with each other, severed in multiple places. Iran arrived at the night of June 22nd. Not just facing American stealth technology, Iran arrived at that night already. Missing 1/3 of its defensive capability, already struggling with broken communication chains, and already operating under the psychological weight of 9 consecutive days of watching its defenses get systematically dismantled. This leads directly to one of the most fundamental and deep-seated failures in Iran's air defense, a failure that existed long before June 2025, long before the Israeli strikes, long before any of this began. That failure is called integration failure, and it is the single most important structural weakness that explains why Iran's air defense behaves less like a coherent defensive system and more like a collection of isolated weapon systems that happen to be located in the same country. A truly effective modern air defense network, K works like a living nervous system. Every radar station that detects something sends that information instantly and automatically through a secure, high-speed digital network to a central command center. The command center analyzes the threat, identifies it, determines which missile battery is best positioned to engage, and sends targeting data to that battery. The battery receives the data, the radar locks on, and the missile fires, all of this happening within seconds of the initial detection. Every link in that chain must work perfectly, and all of those links must work simultaneously in real time, or the entire system loses its ability to respond effectively. Analysis of Iran. As Air Defense Command infrastructure revealed that their system suffered from serious data integration problems, operating in a disjointed manner where radar stations, missile batteries, and command centers, other in real time. They were separate islands of capability rather than one connected, responsive, intelligent defense network. And when stealth jets that are already nearly invisible on radar operate inside a fragmented network like that, even the rare radar system that might catch a fleeting partial glimpse of an approaching stealth aircraft cannot communicate that information fast enough, accurately enough, or reliably enough to a missile battery for that battery to do anything meaningful about it. The window of opportunity to detect, track, and engage a stealth jet is already impossibly narrow. Inside a broken network, that window does not just narrow further, it effectively disappears entirely. Now, let's be precise about exactly what Iran had in terms of hardware, because Iran did not invest nothing in its air defense. Iran invested seriously. Iran spent years and enormous financial resources building a layered air defense system. The centerpiece of Iran's long-range air defense was the Russian-built S-300 PMU-2, a system acquired in 2016 after years of diplomatic and legal battles to secure the purchase. Cited one of Russia's most sophisticated air defense exports. The S-300 made Western military planners take Iran's air defense seriously. It was the system that Pentagon analysts pointed to when discussing the difficulty of any potential military operation against Iran. And here is what happened to every single S-300 battery Iran possessed. Why? In October 2024, 8 months before Operation Midnight Hammer, Israel conducted a series of precision airstrikes and destroyed all of Iran's active S-300 batteries. Everyone. Completely gone. So by the time American B-2 bombers were crossing the Atlantic toward Iran in June 2025, the system that had made Iran's air defense credible for nearly a decade was already 8 months in the past tense. Iran also developed and deployed its own domestically built air defense system called the Bavar 373. Iranian officials described it publicly as Iran's indigenous answer to the S-300. And in some press conferences and military parades, they claimed it was actually superior to Russian systems. They said it could track multiple targets simultaneously. They said it had a range that exceeded the S-300. They said the upgraded version, featuring a missile called the Syed 4B, could engage targets at up to 300 kilometers and track up to 300 separate targets at once. And Iran pointed to the Bavar 373 as the pride of its domestic defense industry, proof that Iran could develop world-class military technology independent of foreign suppliers. On a test range, against known targets flying predictable flight paths in controlled conditions, the Bavar 373 may well perform as advertised. But there's a fundamental difference between test range performance and combat performance when every variable is working against you at once. When stealth jets are approaching from unexpected vectors, when electronic jamming is flooding your radar frequencies with noise, when your communication links have been degraded by 9 days of Israeli strikes, when your command structure has been disrupted, and when the approaching aircraft are flying profiles specifically designed to exploit every weakness in your system simultaneously. Under those real-world, real combat conditions, the Bavar 373 produced the same result as everything else Iran had on the night of June 22nd. Complete silence. Iran also had the Khordad-15 system, another domestically developed air defense weapon that Iranian state media covered extensively with great pride. The Khordad-15 uses a passive phased array radar and was specifically designed, according to Iranian military officials, to detect and engage stealth aircraft. Iranian television programs showed simulations of the Khordad-15 tracking and destroying F-35 fighters. Iranian commanders gave interviews claiming the system could detect stealth jets at 85 kilometers and engage them within 45 kilometers. The narrative inside Iran was that the Khordad-15 represented a genuine breakthrough, that Iran had solved the stealth problem. What the Khordad-15 actually demonstrated on the night of June 22, 2025, and during the 9 days of Israeli strikes before it, was that there is an enormous difference between a simulated capability and a proven one. Iranian radar operators and missile crews never got a reliable targeting solution on incoming stealth aircraft. The systems that survived Israeli strikes were not able to generate the kind of clean, sustained radar lock required to actually fire a missile with any realistic probability of hitting a fifth-generation stealth jet. And many of the Khordad-15 batteries that might have been positioned to try simply were not there anymore, having already been struck in the preceding days of the conflict. Beyond the hardware failures, there's a dimension of this story that most people never hear about. And it is arguably the most decisive factor in why Iran is completely blind to American stealth operations. That dimension is electronic warfare. The United States military does not send stealth jets into hostile airspace alone. Alongside every stealth strike package operates a fleet of specialized aircraft whose entire purpose is not to drop bombs, but to attack the electromagnetic spectrum itself, to reach out invisibly through the air and destroy Iran's ability to use its own radar systems. The primary weapon for this is the EA-18G Growler, a highly specialized aircraft derived from the FA-18 Super Hornet. But instead of bombs and missiles, it carries powerful jamming pods that emit high-power electronic signals specifically tuned to the frequencies used by Iranian air defense radars. When an EA-18G Growler activates its jamming system, Iranian radar operators do not see stealth jets on their screens. They do not even see clean, empty screens. They see white noise, overwhelming, blinding interference that turns every radar display into chaos. The Growler identifies every frequency that an Iranian radar system is actively using, and then floods that frequency with so much electronic noise that the radar becomes useless. Iranian operators who are already struggling to detect stealth aircraft with radar cross-sections the size of marbles are now also fighting through electronic blizzards that make it impossible to tell the difference between an aircraft, interference, noise, and nothing at all. And then there is the trap that comes with attempting to fight back against jamming. If an Iranian radar operator, frustrated and desperate to find the incoming aircraft, decides to increase the power output of his radar, trying to push through the jamming by simply broadcasting more energy, that increased radar emission becomes a targeting signal. The United States has a weapon called the AGM-88 High-Speed Anti-Radiation Missile, or HARM. This missile is specifically designed to detect, home in on, and physically destroy radar transmitters. It follows the radar signal like a bullet following a muzzle flash. If an Iranian radar station increases its output trying to burn through electronic jamming, an AGM-88 is already in the air before the operator realizes what is happening, traveling at over twice the speed of sound directly toward the source of that radar signal. The message to every Iranian radar operator in the airspace that night was brutally simple. Turn on your radar and you will be killed. Stay silent and you are blind. There is no third option. Consider what the United States has been doing in parallel with all the public commitment ceremonies and ribbon cuttings. In 2019, 6 years before the June 2025 strikes, the U.S. quietly transferred the Combined Air and Space Operations Center from Al Udeid to Shaw Air Force Base in South Carolina. The Washington Post was invited to observe what OFO officials called a dress rehearsal. Moving the command center off Qatar's soil back to the continental UNIAS, TED states, away from the 190-kilometer gap between Qatar and Iran. American officials described it as training and exercises. Arab News described it more bluntly. The Americans are re-practicing for a future where Al Udeid no longer exists. That transfer in 2019 was not widely discussed. It did not generate much coverage. But it was a significant statement about how the United States internally assesses its own exposure. Not run a dress rehearsal for relocating your most important regional command center unless you are seriously considering the scenario where relocation becomes necessary. The pattern, then, is this. Publicly, the United States deepens its commitment to Al Udeid, security guarantees, new command facilities, joint training, billions in Qatari investment. The relationship is stronger than ever. Privately, the United States practices leaving, moves command functions to South Sea Aralina, evacuates personnel and aircraft before expected strikes, establishes the minimum acceptable Dama-GE threshold so that base hits below that threshold don't require full military response. Qatar is caught in the middle of this tension. Qatar has invested more than $8 billion in a base that its American partner preemptively evacuates when threats escalate. Qatar signed a defense cooperation agreement, received an unprecedented formal security guarantee, and still watched Iranian missiles strike its territory. Qatar condemned the attack and immediately reaffirmed its commitment to American partnership. Because Qatar has no other choice. The entire foreign policy architecture of Qatar rests on the American military presence. Remove the Americans, and Qatar faces its neighbors, Saudi Arabia and Iran both, without a shield. Qatar knows this. The Qatari government understands that even an America that preemptively evacuates its base is better protection than no America at all. So Qatar keeps investing. Qatar offers the Idaho facility. Qatar accepts the sequential embarrassments. The base hit, the personnel moved out, the aircraft departed, because the alternative is worse. But there is a question hanging over all of this that no one in Washington or Doha has publicly answered. How many times can this cycle repeat before Tihi's strategic value of Al Udeid is fundamentally degraded? The base's power comes from its permanence and credibility. The Combined Air Operations Center directing 21 countries' worth of air campaigns works because everyone, allies and adversaries, assumes it will be there tomorrow. The forward headquarters of CENTCOM functions as a deterrent, partly because its presence signals American commitment to the region. The moment adversaries realize that the base empties before each major escalation, the credibility of that presence changes. It is no longer a permanent commitment. It is a presence that manages its own risk by temporarily retreating. That is a different kind of commitment, a conditional commitment. Iran has already drawn the lesson. January 2026's Iranian warnings to Gulf states, strike U.S. bases if America attacks Iran, were not a new threat. They were the institutionalization of a pattern that had already been proven effective. Iran proved in June 2025 that striking Al Udeid did not trigger a catastrophic American response. Iran proved that America would preemptively reduce its own presence in anticipation of a strike, effectively helping Iran's missiles find fewer targets. And now, 6 months later, the same cycle is running again. The 44 soldiers who stayed at the Patriot batteries in June 2025 understood the geography better than any briefing document. They were the young Est people in the building. The base had been cleared, the planes were gone, the senior personnel had relocated, and they stayed with their missile batteries, watching TE radar for incoming threats, knowing that the entire protection of America's most important regional installation rested on their 2-minute engagement window. They held. The Patriot systems worked. Most of the missiles were destroyed. The base survived and sank functionally, structurally, operationally. But a radome was gone. A communications dome that had been part of Al Udeid's secure network for years was destroyed. And 2 minutes was all that separated a controlled incident from a catastrophe. The United States military is not retreating from Qatar. Not fully, not yet. The formal commitments are real. The investment is real. The 10,000 troops, when they are present, are real. The new combined command post, the Idaho training facility, the security guarantee, all of it represents genuine strategic depth in a relationship that both countries need. But the geography is also real. Qatar is 190 kilometers from Iran. The missiles are faster than decisions. And the clearest statement about Al Udeid's Acro's strategic posture is not found in any press release or ribbon-cutting ceremony. It is found in those satellite images from Planet Labs, the ones captured between June 5th and June 19th, 2025. A tarmac full of aircraft. Then 2 weeks later, the same tarmac, empty. The plane's gone, the people relocated, the base reduced to minimum force posture in the language of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. When a military reduces itself to minimum force posture at its most important regional installation before an expected attack, it is not projecting strength, it is managing exposure. That is the true geography of America's position at Al Udeid. Not the geography of the maps, though those matter. Not the geography of the runways and the hangars and the command centers, though those matter too. The true geography is the geography of credibility. And that geography is shifting. Quietly, operationally, measurably, but shifting. The base is still there. The Americans are still present. Qatar is still committed. But the invisible line that once made Al Udeid untouchable has been crossed and survived. And in military strategy, as in everything else, what has been done once can be done again. The next time the missiles are in the air, the question will not be whether America evacuated in time. He question will be whether evacuation, repeated often enough, becomes the new normal. Whether minimum force posture, activated on rotation whenever Iran gets angry, represents the future of American power in the Middle East. 7 missiles were in the air on June 23, 2025. Most of them were stopped. One of them was not. And somewhere in the silence after the impact, in the gap where a communications dome used to stand, the geography of American power in the Middle East shifted in a way that no press conference has quite managed to explain. Saudi Arabia's central bank converts those yuan into physical gold through the Shanghai gold exchange vaults built on Saudi soil. The entire transaction, from the oil well to the gold vault, happens without a single American bank being involved, without a single swift message being transmitted, without a single moment where Washington has any visibility, any leverage, or any power to say no. This is not a theory. This is not a future scenario. The infrastructure for exactly this transaction exists today. Right now, it is operational. And while all of this was happening in the financial world, China was simultaneously moving on a front that America had always considered its most sacred, most untouchable advantage in the Middle East: military power. America had been Saudi Arabia's security guarantor since the mid-1970s. United States military bases sat on Saudi soil. American aircraft carrier groups patrolled the Persian Gulf. American Patriot missile systems protected Saudi cities from aerial attack. American F-15 fighter jets flew from Saudi airfields. The arrangement was written in steel and jet fuel. America protects Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia prices its oil in dollars. It was the core bargain that kept the whole system running. But China began quietly, carefully inserting itself into this military relationship as well. Displayed some of their most advanced military hardware. In a moment that drew gasps from military observers, the J-10 fighter jet, China's frontline combat aircraft, conducted its first ever live aerial refueling demonstration outside Chinese territory, in front of Saudi military officials, in front of international delegations, on Saudi soil. China was not whispering anymore. China was announcing. Then, in early 2025, the Chinese Navy and the Royal Saudi Naval Forces conducted their third joint maritime exercise together. The operation was called Blue Sword 2025. 2 full weeks of coordinate TED drills in the waters of the region. Chinese and Saudi sailors working side by side, training together, learning each other's communication systems. And the technology relationship goes even deeper than weapons and warships. Saudi Arabia's entire economy is currently in the middle of a historic transformation called Vision 2030. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's sweeping plan to diversify the Saudi economy away from oil dependency and position the kingdom as a global hub for technology, tourism, entertainment, and innovation. This transformation requires enormous investment in the most advanced technologies available: artificial intelligence, cloud computing, quantum research, telecommunications infrastructure, smart city architecture, renewable energy systems. And China has positioned itself as the primary technology partner for nearly all of it. Huawei, China's telecommunications giant, the company that the United States has spent years lobbying every allied government on earth to ban, has deep established roots inside Saudi Arabia's telecommunications infrastructure. Much of the kingdom's national network runs on Huawei equipment. Saudi Aramco, the most valuable company in the history of the world, the absolute crown jewel of Saudi Arabia's economy, uses DeepSeek, a Chinese artificial intelligence platform, at its data centers. Chinese technology companies have begun construction of massive data centers in both Riyadh and Jeddah. These facilities will process and store some of the most commercially and strategically sensitive industrial data generated anywhere in the world. Data about oil production, data about energy infrastructure, data about the economic heartbeat of the entire Middle East. Or known as KAUST, right there inside Saudi Arabia. KAUST is not a standard academic institution. It is the absolute center of Saudi Arabia's ambition to become a global leader in artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and quantum computing. Having Chinese military-linked researchers embedded inside that institution is not a cultural exchange program. It is intelligence access. It is a window into technologies that will define military and economic supremacy for the next 100 years. And China has a seat at the table inside Saudi Arabia's most sensitive research institution. When Chinese President Xi Jinping visited Riyadh in December 2022, the reception he received was unlike anything the Arab world had staged for a foreign leader in recent memory. Saudi fighter jets were repainted in the colors of the Chinese flag to escort his plane as it descended. Saudi military units performed full ceremonial honors. The red carpet stretched further than protocol demanded. The symbolism was deliberate. This was not just a welcome. This was a statement to Washington and to the entire world about which direction the wind was beginning to blow. During that single visit, Saudi Arabia and China signed 34 separate agreements worth $30 billion. $30 billion. In a single state visit. The deals covered green energy, information technology, cloud services, artificial intelligence initiatives, transportation infrastructure, and construction, including technologies with clear potential for dual use in both civilian and military applications. But perhaps the most geopolitically explosive move China made in its Saudi strategy had nothing to do with money, weapons, or technology at all. Iraq, Lebanon, and Bahrain. Their mutual hostility had shaped the fractures and conflicts of an entire region for a generation. American diplomats had tried and failed repeatedly to bring these two deeply hostile powers into any form of meaningful dialogue. Washington had come to accept the Saudi-Iran rivalry as simply a permanent feature of Middle Eastern reality, a wound that would never close, something to be managed, never resolved. A neutral, trusted, capable mediator that both governments respected. And in March 2023, Saudi Arabia and Iran stood together before the world and announced a historic agreement to restore full diplomatic relations, an agreement brokered entirely, completely, and visibly by China. Not by the United States, not by the United Nations, not by any European power or Western institution, by China, the country that was supposed to be a regional outsider, the country that was supposed to lack the diplomatic relationships needed for this kind of breakthrough. This was not simply a diplomatic achievement. This was a seismic announcement, a signal broadcast loud and clear to every government in the Middle East and to every power watching from anywhere on the globe. China is no longer just a trader in this region. China is a force that can accomplish things America cannot, a force that commands trust that America has lost, a force that can shape the future of the most strategically vital region on Earth in ways that Washington had convinced itself were impossible. And all of this, the petroleum, the oil for gold agreement, the $7 billion currency swap, the Enbridge membership, the 400% increase in arms transfers, the drone manufacturing deal, the Blue Sword joint exercises, the Huawei infrastructure, the DeepSeek integration, the KAUST research access, the $30 billion in deals from a single visit, the Iran-Saudi peace agreement, all of it taken together add enormous military spending required to continue its war in Ukraine. At $60, Russia starts drawing down its national savings fund. At $50, Russia starts facing the kind of economic crisis that historically leads to political instability. The price of Russia's Urals crude had already dropped more than 20% since the start of 2025, falling below that critical $60 level. So suddenly, the Saudi Arabia that had been widely described as betraying America to help Russia in 2022 was now the country quietly but effectively crushing the Russian economy in 2025. Not with tanks or diplomatic sanctions or public condemnations, but with oil, with the same weapon it had used against everyone else, simply by pumping more of it. The weapon that Saudi Arabia had once turned against American shale producers was now pointed at Moscow. And the thing that makes this both fascinating and genuinely important is that Saudi Arabia was not doing this for America. It was doing it because Trump had asked for lower prices, because Saudi Arabia wanted a stronger strategic relationship with Washington that would give it access to technology and investment, and because Saudi Arabia was engaged in a long-term battle for global market share against every other producer on Earth simultaneously. This brings us to the deepest truth at the center of everything you have just heard. What looks like betrayal from the outside is actually something much more calculated, much more consistent, and much more revealing than a simple act of disloyalty. Saudi Arabia has never been a traditional ally, not in the way the word is usually meant. It has always been a strategic partner of necessity, a relationship held together by mutually beneficial interests rather than shared values or genuine friendship. The Americans knew this at some level, but they kept acting as though the relationship was something deeper and more durable than the numbers behind it. And every time the numbers changed, they were caught off guard, because they were measuring the relationship in terms of history and sentiment and shared security commitments, while Saudi Arabia was measuring it purely in terms of oil prices, market share, budget requirements, and the best available deal on the table on any given day. China understood this calculus years before most American policymakers admitted it openly. China has been steadily building its relationship with Saudi Arabia for over a decade, signing energy agreements, building economic partnerships, and positioning itself as a reliable buyer without political conditions attached. Today, China buys more than a quarter of all Saudi oil exports. Saudi Arabia has been quietly exploring the idea of settling some of those trades in Chinese yuan rather than US dollars, a shift that would sound purely technical to most people, but carries enormous geopolitical weight. The entire global oil market has been priced in American dollars since that 1945 agreement in the Great Bitter Lake. The so-called petrodollar system is one of the most important foundations of American global financial dominance. Every country that needs oil must first acquire dollars to buy it. That creates permanent global demand for American currency, permanently supporting American financial power. If Saudi Arabia begins selling significant amounts of oil in yuan, it starts chipping away at that foundation, slowly. But the direction matters. Russia understood the transactional nature of the Saudi relationship perfectly and never expected anything more from it. Putin used the OPEC Plus partnership pragmatically, to buy time, to generate revenue, to demonstrate to the world that Russia was not isolated, to keep the sanctions from being fully effective long enough to stabilize the Russian economy around a war footing. When Saudi Arabia pivoted away in 2025, Russia was hurt economically, be they not diplomatically surprised, because in this world, the only betrayal would be expecting something different from a partner who had always been exactly what it presented itself to be, an independent operator, placing its own interests above all other considerations, always. The United States has spent decades learning this lesson and then somehow forgetting it by the time the next crisis arrives. American policymakers keep assuming that because Saudi Arabia depends on American military protection, it will follow American political and economic leadership. But that assumption misses the other side of the equation. America also depends on Saudi Arabia for oil market stability, for regional security cooperation, for intelligence sharing, for influence across the Arab world, for preventing worse actors from filling the vacuum if the relationship collapsed. Both sides need each other. which means neither side holds all the cards. And when neither side holds all the cards, the relationship is a negotiation, not a command structure. The world order that was built in 1945 on that warship in the Great Bitter Lake is not collapsing overnight, but it is visibly, undeniably changing. The assumption that America protects and Saudi Arabia supplies was a deal designed for a specific historical moment, a moment when America was the sole superpower.